The story of Baruch Spinoza begins not with his birth, but with the long shadow of persecution that drove his ancestors from their homeland. Born on November 24, 1632, in the vibrant city of Amsterdam, Spinoza was the product of an exiled community seeking both spiritual and economic refuge. His family belonged to the Sephardic Jewish diaspora, Jews of Iberian origin who had been forced to flee Portugal and Spain due to the Inquisition, which demanded conversion or exile. This communal background would leave a profound imprint on Spinoza's understanding of identity, tradition, and the role of religion in human life. Amsterdam in the early 17th century was a unique space in Europe. Unlike much of the continent, the Dutch Republic was known for its relative religious tolerance and mercantile openness. The city had become a sanctuary for various persecuted groups, especially Jews fleeing the Inquisition. For Spinoza's family, like many others in the Portuguese Jewish community, Amsterdam was both a haven and a crucible, a place to recover from the trauma of exile while navigating the challenges of cultural preservation and integration into a new society. Baruch's father, Miguel de Spinoza, or Michael, was a successful merchant who had re-established the family's fortunes in the bustling trade economy of the Dutch Republic. Miguel's success in business provided the young Baruch with material stability and access to a robust Jewish education, rooted in the traditions of the Sephardic synagogue. The Jewish community in Amsterdam was well-organized and intellectually vibrant, with its own schools, charitable institutions, and religious courts. From an early age, Spinoza was immersed in the texts and teachings of the Torah, Talmud, and commentaries, as well as the rich legacy of medieval Jewish philosophy. Yet, this community, while protective and proud of its heritage, was also deeply conservative in its efforts to preserve religious orthodoxy. The trauma of forced conversions and centuries of secrecy under the Inquisition had instilled in the exiles a zealous commitment to safeguarding their identity through strict adherence to Jewish law. Young Baruch grew up in a culture marked by vigilance, ritual discipline, and a strong sense of collective memory, values that he would later critique, even as he remained deeply shaped by them. The educational curriculum of the Jewish school Spinoza attended was both rigorous and limited in scope. It focused almost exclusively on religious texts, interpreted through the lens of rabbinic authority. However, the surrounding Dutch culture offered a contrasting intellectual world. Amsterdam was also a city of books, ideas, and burgeoning scientific inquiry. Latin schools and secular universities, though not accessible to Jews without conversion, cast their influence far and wide. Enlightenment thought, Cartesian philosophy, and Protestant humanism permeated the air, ideas that would eventually seep into Spinoza's intellectual world, challenging the authority of both tradition and revelation. Spinoza's formative years were thus a dialectical experience, caught between the insular teachings of his religious community and the dynamic openness of the Dutch intellectual climate. This dual exposure was critical. It cultivated in him both the linguistic precision of Talmudic reasoning and an appetite for rational inquiry that exceeded the boundaries of religious doctrine. The dissonance between these two worlds planted the seeds of philosophical doubt and curiosity that would blossom in his later writings. It is important to note that Spinoza's early education was not entirely devoid of philosophical substance. The Sephardic tradition had preserved fragments of the works of thinkers such as Maimonides and Gersonides, who had themselves attempted to harmonize faith with reason. These precedents likely served as both a model and a cautionary tale for Spinoza. They showed the possibilities of integrating rational thought within religious frameworks, but also the limits imposed by orthodoxy. The young Spinoza would take a far bolder path, eventually abandoning the attempt at synthesis altogether. Language played a central role in Spinoza's intellectual awakening. At home and in the synagogue, he spoke Portuguese and Hebrew. In the streets, Dutch, and through his private studies, he would later acquire Latin, the key to the world of classical and modern philosophy. This multilingualism was not simply a practical asset. It symbolized his ability to traverse worlds, cultures, and systems of thought. The polyglot context of Amsterdam made Spinoza not just a citizen of the Dutch Republic, but of a larger philosophical world. Moreover, the commercial background of his family and community likely contributed to his pragmatic, systems-oriented worldview. Trade, after all, demanded clarity, logic, and a degree of secular interaction with a world that stood in contrast to the insularity of religious life. Though he did not pursue a mercantile career in the traditional sense, Spinoza's later philosophical system would reflect a similar emphasis on order, coherence, and universal principles, not unlike the rational laws governing commerce and navigation. The quiet halls of the Talmud Torah school gave no hint of the storm that would one day rise from among its students. Among the rows of earnest boys learning scripture by oil lamp and reciting ancient texts in careful rhythm, Baruch Spinoza was, for a time, no different. He was respectful, attentive, even gifted. His instructors took note of his sharp memory and quick grasp of commentary. But beneath the calm exterior, another current was already flowing. A growing restlessness, a desire to understand the world not just as it had been received through tradition, but as it truly was. The first breach in the walls of orthodoxy came not in the form of rebellion, but curiosity. As Spinoza matured into his teens, he began to seek knowledge beyond what the yeshiva offered. Conversations with merchants, books passed through Dutch acquaintances, and the overheard debates of the city's intellectual cafes opened doors into unfamiliar but irresistible territories. Logic, mathematics, classical philosophy, and, above all, the works of René Descartes. Descartes' method of systematic doubt resonated with something deep in Spinoza. The idea that nothing should be accepted as true unless it could be proven through clear and distinct reasoning. In private, he began reading Latin texts, aided by informal tutors sympathetic to his intellectual hunger. These were not renegades or atheists, but Gentile scholars and converted Jews who recognized in the young man a rare philosophical instinct. With them, Spinoza explored ideas forbidden in the curriculum of his religious teachers. Aristotle, Euclid, and Descartes were not just names in dusty books. They became living companions in thought, voices that spoke a different language than the one of divine command and ritual obedience. This double life, student by day, philosopher by night, could not last forever. As Spinoza's questions grew bolder, so too did the discomfort of those around him. He began to voice doubts during study sessions, questioning the literal interpretation of Scripture, challenging the nature of divine intervention, even suggesting that God might be something other than the personal, anthropomorphic figure described in the Torah. These were not idle provocations, but sincere inquiries, delivered with a calm demeanor that made them all the more disturbing to his teachers. It was around this time that Spinoza encountered the writings of medieval Muslim and Christian thinkers, particularly Averroes and Thomas Aquinas, who had attempted to reconcile philosophy with faith. But where they had sought synthesis, Spinoza found divergence. He admired their rigor, yet found their conclusions unsatisfying. To him, truth could not be split between sacred and secular domains. It had to be unified, complete, and accessible through reason alone. The seeds of a new metaphysics were beginning to take root, even if they had not yet formed into a coherent system. Spinoza's intellectual isolation increased. Though still technically part of the Jewish community, He began to spend less time in religious settings and more in philosophical correspondence. He was drawn to thinkers and skeptics who asked similar questions about God, nature, and the limits of human understanding. His social circle shifted: fewer rabbis, more scholars and free thinkers. These new relationships, while stimulating, also pushed him further from the comfort of shared tradition. He no longer prayed with the same conviction. He no longer accepted commandments without reason. What had once been a spiritual home became a boundary he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, the city of Amsterdam was undergoing its own transformations. The Dutch Republic was at the height of its golden age, prosperous, artistic, and intellectually fertile. Universities published revolutionary works in natural philosophy, and the printing press brought foreign ideas to eager Dutch readers. The atmosphere was electric, charged with debate and discovery. Spinoza found himself aligned not with any one sect, but with the broader current of rational humanism that questioned inherited truths and sought natural explanations for all things. One event, though minor in appearance, marked a critical moment in his turn away from tradition: his rejection of a promising leadership role in the synagogue. Such a position would have granted him status, comfort, and stability, but Spinoza declined it. In doing so, he sent a clear signal to the elders that his path would not follow the one prepared for him. He chose instead a path of inquiry, a decision that left many around him feeling betrayed or baffled, unsure of how such a bright young man could so easily walk away from his inheritance. Yet Spinoza was not rejecting spirituality, he was redefining it. For him, understanding God required more than obedience. It demanded comprehension of nature, cause, and logic. His faith, if it could be called that, was rooted in the conviction that the universe was not arbitrary, but intelligible, structured by laws that human reason could discern. The divine, in his evolving view, was not a being who issued decrees, but the very substance of existence itself. Eternal, necessary, and indivisible. The year was 1656, and the doors of the synagogue that had once welcomed Baruch Spinoza as a precocious child now opened to pronounce his spiritual death. It was a summer morning in Amsterdam, but the atmosphere inside the Portuguese Jewish congregation was heavy with ritual gravity. On the wooden bema, the elders stood robed and solemn, as a cantor recited in Hebrew a decree centuries old yet rarely invoked in such a severe form. The Hurim, a total excommunication. The sentence was brief but thunderous, declaring that Spinoza was cursed by day and cursed by night, and that no member of the community should speak to him, read his writings, or stand within 6 feet of his presence. There was no formal trial, no opportunity for defense. The decision was swift, final, and public. Rumors swirled that Spinoza had spoken blasphemies, denied the immortality of the soul, and questioned the divine authorship of the Bible. The specific charges were not spelled out, nor were they necessary. For a community already under scrutiny by Dutch authorities and wary of attracting attention, Spinoza's increasingly radical ideas posed a threat not only to doctrine, but to survival. His expulsion was as much a political act as a religious one, a way of preserving the fragile harmony between Jewish autonomy and Dutch tolerance. For Spinoza, the Hurim was not unexpected. He had known for months that the whispers had grown louder, that his words were finding their way back to the synagogue, distorted and feared. Friends who once shared wine and debate with him now avoided eye contact. Books he had lent out were not returned. One evening, as he left a study circle, a man even attempted to stab him with a knife, muttering accusations of heresy. Though the blade only tore his cloak, the message was clear. He was no longer safe among his own people. The decree forced Spinoza to leave his family, his community, and the city he had known all his life. He adopted the Latinized name Benedictus and departed Amsterdam quietly, taking with him a small collection of books, a modest inheritance from his father's estate, and the tools of a lens grinder, a craft he had begun to learn in secret. From this point forward, Spinoza would live a life of philosophical solitude, unbound by tradition, but also estranged from the warmth of belonging. His first refuge was the nearby village of Ouderkerk, and later Regensburg, a quiet town nestled near Leiden. These places lacked the intellectual buzz of Amsterdam, but offered something more valuable to Spinoza at the time: anonymity. He lived modestly, often in a single rented room, subsisting on the small income he earned from crafting lenses for microscopes and telescopes. The precision and care required in this work mirrored his methodical mind. He polished not only glass, but thoughts, cutting through confusion and illusion to seek what he believed was the clear light of truth. The act of excommunication, though painful, gave Spinoza a peculiar freedom. No longer beholden to religious authorities or communal expectations, he was now free to pursue his inquiries without censorship. He began composing treatises and essays, refining ideas that had long gestated in his mind. Rather than retreat into bitterness or resentment, he turned inward and upward, toward the architecture of reason and the structure of the universe. He sought not vengeance, but understanding. Yet exile brought other challenges. He had to rebuild his intellectual community from scratch, rely on a small network of correspondents, most of them non-Jews, some Protestant, others skeptical of all faiths. In these letters, written in Latin and preserved with great care, we see a man both deeply engaged with the pressing questions of his time and also increasingly isolated by the radical nature of his conclusions. He wrote cautiously, aware that his ideas might provoke not only theological outrage, but also political consequences. The memory of Giordano Bruno, burned alive for similar transgressions, was not far from his mind. Despite these dangers, Spinoza remained intellectually fearless. He refused offers to publish anonymously or to soften his arguments. Even in private letters, he avoided deceit. He did not seek confrontation, but he would not bend truth to appease comfort. He knew that he was constructing something entirely new, a philosophy of immanence, in which God was not beyond the world but synonymous with it, in which the soul did not transcend the body, but existed as its expression, and in which morality sprang not from divine command, but from the pursuit of rational understanding. The Her-Im that cast Spinoza into the wilderness did not destroy him. It clarified him. It separated him from inherited identity and compelled him to create himself anew, not as a renegade, but as a philosopher of astonishing coherence. In the silence that followed his excommunication, he did not retreat, but sharpened his thought into the powerful works that would later define his legacy. If Amsterdam had expelled him, the world of philosophy would eventually claim him as one of its most original minds. The village of Regensburg, nestled amid flat Dutch farmlands and veiled in coastal fog, seemed an unlikely birthplace for radical philosophy. Yet it was here, in a modest room above a house belonging to a Mennonite family, that Baruch Spinoza began to shape the system of thought that would later redefine the foundations of metaphysics. The simplicity of his surroundings contrasted sharply with the magnitude of his intellectual vision. A small wooden desk, a few books stacked beside a grinding lathe, and a single window overlooking the quiet street. This was the universe from which his ideas would emerge. Living among the collegians, a pacifist Christian sect known for its egalitarian values and suspicion of dogma, Spinoza found a rare atmosphere of tolerance. They did not share his beliefs, but they respected his intellect and his need for independence. Their gatherings, centered on free discussion rather than formal liturgy, may have provided a subtle encouragement to Spinoza's pursuit of a religion of reason. These gentle dissidents, with their plain clothing and open dialogue, offered him a social world that neither persecuted nor constrained him. His days settled into a rhythm of labor and contemplation. In the mornings, he worked with glass, shaping and polishing lenses with quiet precision. His fingers became calloused, his eyesight strained, but the craft brought more than income. It brought discipline. The act of grinding a lens required patience, a steady hand, and total focus. In this tactile world, Spinoza found an analogy for philosophy. Just as a lens brings clarity to vision, so too could reason bring clarity to the mind. Afternoons were reserved for study and writing. Spinoza often walked alone through the fields, thinking aloud, jotting notes into the small leather-bound journals he kept hidden from view. He read deeply: Descartes, Hobbes, Lucretius, the Bible in Hebrew and Latin, and from these materials began constructing a philosophical edifice of his own. It was not built hastily. Every term had to be precise, every proposition grounded. He sought not just coherence, but necessity, a system that could not be otherwise. By now, he had become more than a solitary thinker. He was a point of quiet gravity. Letters began arriving from across Europe. Scholars inquiring about Cartesian metaphysics, theologians probing his views on divine nature, skeptics seeking dialogue. These correspondences, often lengthy and subtle, allowed Spinoza to refine his thoughts and test them against the brightest minds of the age. He replied with humility, patience, and clarity. Even when confronted by hostility or confusion, he never retaliated. His manner was disarmingly calm, as though philosophy were not a battlefield, but a garden to be cultivated. Though hidden from public life, Spinoza's reputation was beginning to grow in elite intellectual circles. His treatises circulated in manuscript form, hand-copied and passed discreetly between trusted readers. He was known as the Hebrew philosopher, the new Moses, or to his critics, simply a dangerous atheist. But in Regensburg, he remained anonymous to most of his neighbors, an artisan with serious eyes and a quiet manner. He lived without excess, refusing honors and avoiding debts, owning only what he needed to survive and think. One of his most intimate friendships during this period was with Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society in London. Their letters covered a vast range of subjects: natural science, theology, ethics, and through Oldenburg, Spinoza kept a window open to the intellectual ferment of England. He admired the English experiment in political liberty, though he remained wary of popular religion and mob rule. The correspondence allowed him to follow developments in optics, astronomy, and political theory, even as he remained physically removed from the centers of power. Despite his remote lifestyle, Spinoza was not indifferent to the world's upheavals. He watched from afar as war, revolution, and religious strife unfolded across Europe. The brutal suppression of dissent, the manipulation of scripture for political ends, and the rise of fanatical movements all confirmed what he increasingly believed, that the freedom to think and speak without fear was the most precious condition of human flourishing. This conviction would later find full expression in his political writings. Regensburg was not his final refuge. In 1663, he moved to Voorburg and later to The Hague, seeking closer proximity to publishers, friends, and intellectual allies. Each relocation was modest: a new rented room, a new set of neighbors, but always with the same simplicity. He refused offers of university positions and declined generous patronage that would have compromised his independence. He had no wife, no children, no estate to manage. His only legacy, he believed, would be his ideas. In the quietude of Voorburg, where the narrow canals mirrored the gray skies and windmills turned lazily in the damp breeze, Baruch Spinoza began what would become his most daring intellectual endeavor, the writing of Ethica, Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata, ethics demonstrated in geometrical order. It was a work unlike anything philosophy had seen before, an audacious synthesis of mathematics and metaphysics. To describe the human mind, God, nature, emotion, and freedom not in rhetorical flourishes, but in propositions, axioms, and corollaries. It was an act of sheer philosophical confidence, a rebellion wrapped in rigor. Spinoza chose to construct his masterwork as Euclid had built his elements, from definitions, each chosen with clinical precision, and from axioms that seemed self-evident. He laid out a sequence of logical steps that led the reader, inescapably, toward a new vision of the universe. This was not just a stylistic decision. It was the expression of his core belief that truth must be necessary, not contingent. To persuade with beauty was one thing. To compel with logic, quite another. The labor was immense. Each definition had to bear enormous weight. What did it mean to define substance, or mode, or God? In Spinoza's hands, these were not theological concepts, but philosophical tools. God was not a being, but being itself, an infinite, necessary, self-caused substance. Everything else, trees, planets, minds, and emotions, were modes, modifications of that one eternal substance. There was no outside to God, no room for dualism, no realm beyond nature. Spinoza's universe was all-encompassing, and it left no place for the supernatural. As he refined the ethics, Spinoza sought to unify seemingly disparate domains of thought: the metaphysical, the psychological, the ethical, and the spiritual. He believed that understanding the nature of existence was inseparable from understanding the self. Human bondage, he wrote, was the result of inadequate ideas, passions, and false beliefs that enslaved us. True freedom was not found in external liberty, but in the internal clarity that arose from knowing necessity. To be free was to align one's self with nature, to see clearly, and to act with reason. Writing the ethics was not merely a technical feat. It was a form of personal salvation. Spinoza, whose life had been marked by exile, estrangement, and silence, poured into his work a vision of profound inner peace. The final part of the treatise culminates in a description of the intellectual love of God, a serene and joyous state in which one understands oneself as part of the infinite. It was not an emotional fervor, but a rational ecstasy, a clarity so deep it became a kind of transcendence. But the work was dangerous. Even among his most sympathetic friends, there was unease. To deny a personal, providential God, to treat miracles as natural events misunderstood, to reduce the soul to an aspect of the mind rather than an immortal essence. These were not merely unorthodox claims. They were theological explosives. Spinoza knew that publication during his lifetime could bring not only condemnation but prosecution. He kept the manuscript hidden, locked away, known only to a trusted circle. He tested parts of his system in smaller writings and letters. He published a short work on Descartes' principles, edited a treatise on the rainbow, and circulated thoughts on politics and religion. But the ethics remained his secret cathedral, a structure too radical to be unveiled while he lived. He corrected it obsessively, rewriting whole sections when even a single proposition felt imprecise. The work consumed years, yet he refused to compromise. Every line had to be true. Every conclusion had to be unassailable. His philosophical method, while cold in form, burned with inner conviction. Spinoza believed that to understand reality was to love it, not in a sentimental sense, but through a deep, rational embrace. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare, he would later write at the close of the Ethics, a final line that echoed his own journey. He had not chosen the easy path. He had chosen the necessary one. Those who visited him during this period were often struck by the quiet dignity of his manner. He did not lecture, nor impose his ideas with force. He discussed them with clarity and calmness, inviting reasoned disagreement, yet never yielding to pressure. His small, Spartan room, filled with lenses and manuscripts, was a crucible of thought. Here, without institutional support, without titles or wealth, a man was attempting to rebuild philosophy from the ground up. Though Baruch Spinoza lived a life far removed from the courts and parliaments of his time, the turbulence of the political world was never far from his thoughts. The Dutch Republic, where he made his quiet home, was one of the few places in 17th century Europe that allowed a measure of religious and philosophical freedom. But even in this liberal enclave, tensions ran high between Republicans and monarchists, between Calvinists and dissenters, and between those who welcomed free inquiry and those who feared its consequences. Spinoza observed it all with the eye of a philosopher and the caution of one who knew too well the price of public expression. During his years in The Hague, where he settled in a modest room near the court buildings, Spinoza paid close attention to the political debates of the day. He followed the speeches and pamphlets, the arrests of dissenting ministers, and the violent skirmishes between factions. The murder of Johann de Witt in 1672, a Republican statesman and one of the Republic's most enlightened leaders, shocked him profoundly. De Witt had been lynched and mutilated by an angry mob, incited by rumors and religious rhetoric. For Spinoza, it was a brutal illustration of what happened when ignorance and superstition guided political action. In the aftermath of de Witt's death, Spinoza reportedly rushed to write a protest in defense of the fallen statesman and against the mob's barbarity. His landlord, fearing for his life, prevented him from leaving the house. The incident left an indelible mark. It reminded Spinoza that truth, no matter how carefully reasoned, could fall victim to passion and power. The philosopher who had spent years constructing a rational vision of existence now saw, firsthand, the volatility of human nature in the political sphere. Rather than retreat into despair, Spinoza began to develop his political philosophy with renewed urgency. He did not seek utopia or idealism. His approach was grounded in a clear-eyed realism about human desires, fears, and the limits of reason. In his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published anonymously in 1670, he laid out a daring argument that the freedom to philosophize and speak one's mind was essential not only for individual dignity, but for the health of the state itself. The treatise defended the separation of theology and politics. Scripture, Spinoza argued, should not be read as a scientific or historical account, but as a moral guide, a product of its time, shaped by metaphor and tradition. Governments, he contended, should not enforce religious doctrine. Instead, their primary role was to preserve peace and protect freedom. A state that suppressed thought would inevitably collapse into tyranny. For Spinoza, liberty was not a threat to order, it was the foundation of it. The Tractatus was controversial the moment it appeared. Though published without his name, Spinoza's style and ideas were unmistakable. Clerics and civic leaders condemned the book as heretical, atheistic, and dangerous. It was banned in several provinces. Yet it spread widely, read in private salons, and whispered about in university circles. Its blend of boldness and clarity was magnetic. Spinoza had done something few dared. He had challenged the very authority of revelation in the name of reason and civic peace. In writing on politics, Spinoza broke from many of his contemporaries. While Hobbes had argued for absolute sovereignty as a remedy for chaos, Spinoza envisioned a republic where laws were shaped by the collective reason of free citizens. He trusted neither kings nor mobs, but placed cautious hope in education, dialogue, and institutional checks. He viewed democracy not as perfect, but as the least likely to fall under the control of passion-driven rulers or sects. The political writings also revealed a more personal side of Spinoza, one that believed deeply in human potential. He was no misanthrope. Beneath his austere logic lay a faith in humanity's capacity to grow, to understand, and to live together in peace. He knew that fear and superstition were powerful forces, but he believed they could be overcome through knowledge and ethical cultivation. For him, freedom was not license, but self-mastery, both in the individual and in the body politic. Though he never held office, gave public speeches, or led protests, Spinoza's influence on the political thought of Europe would prove profound. His ideas anticipated Enlightenment calls for tolerance, secularism, and constitutional government. He helped prepare the ground for future revolutions, not by inciting rebellion, but by planting the seeds of rational liberty. He had seen the worst of political cruelty and still dared to speak of justice. In the hushed atmosphere of Spinoza's modest lodgings in The Hague, a steady trickle of letters arrived from across Europe. These were no ordinary notes. They carried the voices of mathematicians, theologians, skeptics, and natural philosophers, each addressing the recluse whose thoughts were stirring quiet revolutions. The philosopher who had been cast out by his own community and who lived in near obscurity had, without traveling, established a far-reaching intellectual network. His friends and correspondents became vital conduits through which his ideas were tested, sharpened, and discreetly shared. Among his most enduring correspondence was Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society in London. Their exchange, conducted in Latin, covered not only metaphysics and theology, but also optics, scientific method, and the boundaries of knowledge. Oldenburg respected Spinoza's intellect, though he remained cautious about the more radical implications of his thought. Their tone was often cordial, though occasionally tense, especially when Spinoza's views on God and Scripture came under scrutiny. Yet, these letters served a deeper purpose. They tethered Spinoza to the broader European conversation of his time. In addition to Oldenburg, Spinoza maintained correspondence with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who would later rise to philosophical prominence. Their brief meeting in The Hague was polite but charged with tension. Leibniz was curious, perhaps even admiring, but also wary of the implications of Spinoza's monism. After Spinoza's death, Leibniz would distance himself publicly, but traces of Spinoza's influence would still echo in his work. Their exchange was a meeting of two formidable minds, each carving a path through the dense forest of metaphysics from opposite directions. Spinoza also exchanged letters with the Dutch physician and thinker Lambert van Belthuizen, whose criticism was sharp and pointed. Velthuizen challenged Spinoza on moral and theological grounds, accusing him of undermining divine justice and virtue. Spinoza responded patiently, without malice, clarifying his concepts of good and evil, reward and punishment. These correspondences were not mere academic exercises. They were battles for clarity, for intellectual integrity, and for truth. Despite his reclusive lifestyle, Spinoza formed close friendships with those who visited him in person. One of the most devoted was Georg Gels, a wealthy Amsterdam merchant and amateur philosopher. Gels supported Spinoza financially, enabling him to live modestly without being beholden to any institution. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared conviction. Gels would later be instrumental in preserving and publishing Spinoza's manuscripts after his death, recognizing their significance when others feared their consequences. Another of Spinoza's trusted friends was Ludwig Meyer, a physician and dramatist who had edited the controversial Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Meyer was a kindred spirit, a rationalist with literary flair who helped bridge the gap between Spinoza's abstract Latin and the minds of contemporary readers. Their collaboration was quiet but essential. Without Meyer's guidance, much of Spinoza's work might have remained inaccessible or misunderstood. Even more intimate was Spinoza's bond with Peter Van Gent, a former student turned confidant. Van Gent would visit frequently, bringing news, books, and occasionally material comforts. Their conversations often stretched late into the night, touching on both the philosophical and the personal. To Van Gent, Spinoza revealed his moments of doubt, his reflections on mortality, and his quiet joys. In these rare exchanges, the philosopher's stoic mask sometimes softened into human warmth. Spinoza's circle also included members of the dissenting Christian sects, the Remonstrants, the Collegians, the Mennonites, who, though not sharing his metaphysics, admired his integrity and his insistence on peaceful dialogue. They offered him not only intellectual companionship, but also a kind of protection. Among them, he was not an enemy, but a fellow seeker, one whose ideas were bold, but whose life was gentle. Letters were Spinoza's lifeline to the world. He wrote them with the same care he applied to his philosophical works, precise, lucid, and respectful. He did not seek converts, but understanding. He knew that ideas could not be forced upon others, only shared and examined. His correspondence was not propaganda. It was a practice of intellectual ethics, an expression of a life lived in pursuit of rational harmony. In the final years of his life, Baruch Spinoza found solace in a world of glass and light. Though his philosophical manuscripts formed the core of his intellectual legacy, it was his humble trade, grinding optical lenses, that shaped the rhythms of his daily existence. In a small, dimly lit room in The Hague, lit by northern sunlight and thick with the scent of oil and dust, Spinoza labored patiently over convex and concave surfaces. He was no mere tinkerer. He was a skilled artisan whose lenses were sought after by astronomers and natural philosophers across Europe. The work demanded extraordinary precision. Each lens had to be shaped with an almost meditative focus, the curvature refined by hand, the surface smoothed with care, and the final polish applied until the glass revealed its secrets. Spinoza's hands, accustomed to the delicate contours of philosophical argument, found a similar rhythm in this physical craft. He would sit for hours at his workbench, the soft scrape of grinding paste the only sound, as he shaped the instruments that would allow others to explore the heavens and the microscopic world. Though he earned little from this labor, it provided him with just enough to live. His needs were few: modest food, a single set of clothes, books, ink, and paper. He refused numerous offers of patronage, including a lucrative position at Heidelberg University, which would have brought prestige but required him to moderate his views. Spinoza valued independence above comfort. He knew that to live freely meant to think freely. And to think freely, one could not be beholden to power, even benevolent power. His lens-making, while a means of subsistence, also served as a metaphor for his philosophy. Just as lenses brought clarity to blurred vision, so too did reason reveal the underlying unity of all things. Spinoza believed that true understanding required one to look beyond appearances, beyond dogma, passion, and surface chaos, into the inner workings of nature. Each polished lens, then, was not only a scientific instrument, but an emblem of intellectual discipline and moral clarity. Yet the work was not without its cost. The fine glass dust that accumulated during the grinding process, though nearly invisible, was lethal in slow increments. Spinoza had long suffered from tuberculosis, and the constant inhalation of microscopic particles worsened his condition. His thin frame grew thinner, his breathing more labored. Still, he continued his craft, refusing to allow illness to interrupt the calm precision of his daily life. As his health declined, his pace of writing slowed, but his mind remained sharp. He made final revisions to his ethics, quietly prepared manuscripts for publication, and arranged with close friends for their preservation. To those who visited, he appeared serene, calm in the face of mortality, committed to the life of the mind even as the body weakened. He did not speak of fear or regret. Instead, he discussed geometry, philosophy, and the nature of eternal truths. In these last months, Spinoza's visitors noted a certain luminous quality in his demeanor. He spoke softly but with conviction, expressing contentment with the life he had chosen. He had never married, never accumulated wealth, never wielded influence in the traditional sense. But he had lived with consistency, with integrity, and with the quiet power of a thinker who asks nothing but understanding. Occasionally, he would still accept guests from abroad. Young students, curious philosophers, and even skeptical clerics who wished to witness the enigmatic thinker in person. They found not a heretic with fiery proclamations, but a courteous, modest man who served tea, answered questions, and never sought to convert. He offered, instead, the clarity of thought and the steadiness of reason. On Sunday, February 21st, 1677, Spinoza passed away in the modest room he had occupied for nearly a decade. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning. His friends buried him quietly in the new church of The Hague. But even as his body returned to the earth, his ideas were already beginning their long journey into the consciousness of Europe. His final request had been honored, that his major works be published posthumously under the title Opera Posthuma. When the door to Spinoza's small apartment finally closed behind him forever, it did not shut upon his thought. On the contrary, his death unlocked the passage for his most profound work to enter the world. In the months following his quiet burial, his closest friends, especially Gerard Gels, Lodewijk Meyer, and Jan Ruwerts, undertook a task that they had long known was coming: the editing and publication of Spinoza's unpublished writings. The result would be the Opera Posthuma, a volume of considerable danger and transformative power, destined to disturb the slumbering minds of Europe. The compilation included several key texts: the Ethics, written in geometrical order, the Tractatus Politicus, which extended Spinoza's political ideas, a grammar of the Hebrew language, and his vast correspondence, which revealed the range and subtlety of his interactions with Europe's thinkers. Each page had to be reviewed with care, not only to preserve his meaning, but to avoid legal repercussions. Publishing such material, especially under the shadow of religious orthodoxy, was an act of moral courage. The Ethics, perhaps Spinoza's most enduring work, presented a vision of the universe unlike anything the modern world had seen. Written in the austere style of Euclidean geometry, it built its arguments from definitions and axioms, leading the reader step by step toward a metaphysical system where God, nature, and the universe were one and the same. It was a cold blaze of thought, uncompromising in its clarity. There was no room for personal gods, no divine commands, no miracles, only necessity, unity, and understanding. Upon its release, the opera postuma did not provoke immediate public uproar. It was too dense, too unusual, too far removed from common forms of religious or political speech. But among scholars, it was electric. Reactions varied wildly. Some condemned the work as godless. Others admired its coherence. There were those who whispered that Spinoza had discovered something truly new, and those who feared the implications of his daring system. But whether read with admiration or suspicion, it was read. Quietly, in salons and libraries, the ideas began to spread. The publication also triggered a new wave of philosophical resistance. Theologians and church authorities in both Catholic and Protestant lands moved to ban the book. It was listed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum by the Catholic Church and denounced in sermons across Europe. In Amsterdam, where Spinoza had once lived in exile from his own community, owning a copy could be cause for surveillance. Still, the book traveled, carried in secret, translated in fragments, passed between thinkers in the margins of power. The radical nature of Spinoza's ideas was not just metaphysical, but ethical. In the Ethics, he argued that true freedom did not lie in resisting nature, but in understanding it. Human beings, he claimed, were not separate from nature, but part of its unfolding. By aligning our desires with the rational order of things, we attain not control over fate, but peace with it. The highest good, for Spinoza, was not wealth or status, but intellectual love of God, the serene joy that came from understanding our place in the vast order of existence. This deeply personal and inward vision of freedom resonated with a small but growing group of readers, many of whom would go on to shape the Enlightenment. Thinkers such as Pierre Bell, Denis Diderot, and later Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Nietzsche would each encounter Spinoza's work, wrestle with it, and draw inspiration from its relentless honesty. Even when they disagreed, they could not ignore the power of his system. The opera postuma also preserved the method behind the man. Spinoza's geometric style, so austere and mechanical, became a signature that set him apart from both classical and contemporary thinkers. His refusal to appeal to rhetoric, emotion, or anecdote was not a lack of passion, but a disciplined attempt to build a philosophy of enduring clarity. His was not a voice that shouted. It whispered across centuries, drawing seekers to its strange lucidity. Meanwhile, copies of his books were smuggled into university libraries and private collections. Translators in England, France, and Germany began piecing together versions for broader audiences. Slowly, a reputation formed, not of a heretic, but of a visionary, not of a radical destroyer, but of a system builder. He became a philosopher's philosopher, one whose work rewarded patience and demanded precision. In this quiet but persistent spread, the legacy of Baruch Spinoza took root. The man who had died alone, surrounded by tools and manuscripts, had become an unseen companion to generations of thinkers. His ideas, so carefully honed and so long suppressed, had escaped the walls of his room and taken flight. And as the 18th century approached, they were already beginning to reshape how people saw God, nature, freedom, and themselves. More than 3 centuries after Baruch Spinoza's death, his presence persists, not as a ghost haunting the past, but as a quiet, crystalline voice in the living thought of the modern world. His words have become a touchstone for those who seek a rigorous and fearless philosophy, a vision of life unclouded by superstition, power, or sentimentality. In libraries, universities, and hidden corners of private reflection, his ideas continue to unfold with an uncanny sense of relevance. The man who was once shunned, excommunicated, and misunderstood has become an enduring presence in the architecture of Western thought. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, and with it a newfound respect for the independence of reason. Philosophers like Lessing, Herder, and Goethe discovered in Spinoza a kind of quiet guide, an advocate for intellectual freedom and emotional equanimity. Goethe, in particular, was captivated by Spinoza's serenity and consistency. He found in Spinoza not just a system of ideas, but a model for how to live a life governed by harmony rather than turmoil. Spinoza, for Goethe, was the philosopher who taught him to look at the world with calm eyes. In the 19th century, Spinoza's thought became a battleground of interpretation. German idealists like Hegel saw in him a precursor to their own dialectical visions of unity and development, while Romantic thinkers wrestled with the tension between his cold clarity and their yearning for the sublime. Nietzsche, never easily impressed, nevertheless acknowledged Spinoza as a kindred spirit, another solitary figure who challenged morality at its roots and sought a new way to affirm life through understanding, rather than guilt or fear. Spinoza's rejection of free will resonated with Nietzsche's own ideas of determinism and eternal recurrence. The scientific revolution, too, found in Spinoza a curious ally. His concept of nature as a unified, self-sustaining order mirrored the emerging cosmology of physics. Though he lacked the empirical methods that later defined science, his intuition of a world governed not by miracles, but by unbreakable laws made him strangely prescient. Albert Einstein would famously refer to his own belief in Spinoza's God, not a deity who intervenes in the world, but the sum of all that is governed by necessity and symmetry. For Einstein, Spinoza provided a bridge between science and a spiritual sense of wonder. Yet Spinoza's influence did not remain confined to the elite. In the 20th and 21st centuries, his ideas spilled into political theory, psychology, and even literature. His notions of freedom through understanding and peace through rational acceptance gained traction in movements seeking human rights, secular ethics, and democratic resilience. His political writings, once dismissed as utopian, gained a second life amid the rethinking of governance, liberty, and the relationship between individuals and the state. In contemporary philosophy, Spinoza is no longer seen as a mere historical figure, but as a fountain still flowing with relevance. Philosophers like Gilles Deleuze reinterpreted his ideas through the lens of post-structuralism, emphasizing his concept of effect, the body, and immanence. His monism, once seen as rigid and abstract, has become a resource for rethinking ecology, systems theory, and the interconnectedness of life. In an age grappling with environmental collapse, Spinoza's insistence on our embeddedness in nature offers not just insight, but a call to humility. The language of his writings, once austere and forbidding, has been translated and softened, making his ethics accessible to new audiences. Courses in universities now treat Spinoza not as a historical footnote, but as a central figure, a philosopher who dared to unify metaphysics, ethics, and politics into a single framework. Artists and poets have also turned to him, drawn by his vision of a world that contains no division between body and soul, reason and emotion, sacred and profane. Spinoza's personal life, once hidden behind his impersonal style, now invites quiet admiration. The man who refused fame, who declined patronage, who chose solitude over compromise, has become a kind of philosophical saint, one whose very life was an experiment in integrity. In a world driven by spectacle and self-promotion, Spinoza's humility and consistency are not just rare, they are radical. His life reminds us that ideas do not need noise to endure, they only need depth. And so his legacy flows forward, not as doctrine, but as direction. He does not offer easy answers or emotional comfort, but something more durable, a way of seeing clearly, of accepting calmly, of living wisely. In a time when confusion often masquerades as complexity, Spinoza's clarity becomes a form of courage. Thus, the philosopher who once walked quietly through the streets of Rigisburg and The Hague walks still through the minds of those who dare to think without fear, who seek freedom not in rebellion, but in understanding. His thought, like a lens finely ground, continues to shape the way we see, not through distortion, but through light.